All right, so we are going to briefly talk about the American Revolution. So we've been looking at different types of revolutions. We talked about Enlightenment ideas and how those Enlightenment ideas were going to start to challenge traditional authority. So we looked at the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. So the bloodless exchange of power from James II to William and Mary. And we talked about how the English were able to change their form of government successfully a few times over. So now we're going to look at the American Revolution. We're going to talk about some of the Enlightenment ideas and how those influenced the American Revolution and the impact that that's going to have on the French Revolution. So we're looking at the American Revolution and the colonies. Let's talk first about why the British were in America and British influence in America first. So if you remember mercantilism from Unit 5, mercantilism basically says that a country's strength depends upon its wealth. And so the British were using these colonies to create wealth for Great Britain. And so the British basically relied on the colonies to generate this wealth. The colonies created or generated raw materials that then the British could manufacture into manufactured goods, and then they could sell those to other countries and back to the colonies as well. So the colonies over time, over through mercantilism, become more independent from Britain. And this is going to be due to the fact that just the colonies become more well established and also due to Enlightenment ideas. People are starting to take these Enlightenment ideas and put them into action. There's also the issue of the British taxation on the colonists. So um, we have talked about the effect that war has on the common people, and specifically for the colonists. Every time that the British went to war, the British were heavily taxing the colonists. And this was true with the French and Indian War, in which the British were able to take land from the French. But unfortunately for the colonists, the taxation on the colonists was what funded the French and Indian War. And so as taxation increases, smugglers are easily able to evade British authorities and actually smuggle goods into these colonies in the Americas because the taxation on British goods was so high that people were wanting to purchase goods from other countries. And so it ended up being a lot cheaper for colonists to sometimes purchase goods from other countries instead of purchasing British goods because, again, the taxation was incredibly high. So it creates hostility between the colonists and the British government. And this comes with the Intolerable Acts. So the British start to limit the exports and the imports of the colonists. They start to crack down on the illegal smuggling of goods into the colonies, and they start to, again, raise taxes on the colonies, which leads to the boycott of British goods by colonists. And the colonists really start to take to these Enlightenment ideas. So we've already talked about some of the Enlightenment thinkers, so you're going to hear a couple of those and their ideas reflected in um, these notes. You're also going to look at it in like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So we're going to see how some of those ideas pop up there. So due to the Intolerable Acts and due to the increased taxation, the colonists call the First Continental Congress, which this is when the colonists write the Declaration of Independence, which declares the colonies independent from Great Britain. So for Great Britain, this is a problem because they don't wish to obviously lose their colonies. This is a huge part of what is economically funding and supporting Great Britain. And so this is what leads to the Revolutionary War. But quickly, some Enlightenment ideas that are reflected in the Declaration of Independence and that are also fueling the revolution for the colonists is Thomas Jefferson. He wants freedom of speech. He also wants freedom of religion. And if you remember, that is very much a idea from Voltaire. So voice, Voltaire, freedom of speech. And he encourages this rebellion against the British government. And also Thomas Paine. We didn't talk about Thomas Paine, but Thomas Paine actually supports John Locke's ideas, which we did talk about John Locke. So John Locke, if you remember, talks about how every man has the right to life, liberty, and property. All men are created equal in rights. So promoted John Locke's ideas. So we're going to see these two ideas reflected in the revolution. So when the Revolutionary War starts, and we're going to briefly talk about this, we're not going to go through battles. You guys will get that in U.S. history. But The Americans are very poorly trained but highly motivated. And this actually works out in their favor because the British were underfunded and overconfident because the British didn't really take this rebellion seriously. And unfortunately for the British, they're also going to have to fight the French in the Revolutionary War because the French joined the side of the colonists. Um, they assist the American forces because if you remember previously, I had said that from the French and Indian War, France had lost some territory. Basically, everything that they had in the Americas east of the Mississippi, they had to give to Great Britain. And so the French obviously have some hostility towards the British, and historically, the British and the French don't get along. So the French saw this as an opportunity to kind of stick it to the British, so they aid the Americans in the Revolutionary War. And of course, the Americans are successful in establishing their independence from Great Britain. So we're going to fast forward through that and talk about the Articles of Confederation. This is basically our first draft of a constitution. It creates a weak central government. And so this is what leads to the newer constitution being written later on. So the convention was called again. A new constitution is written, strengthens the federal government, and also the Bill of Rights is added to protect the basic rights of citizens. So let's talk about what is reflected in those constitutional articles, or those Enlightenment ideas that are reflected in those constitutional articles. So we have "We the people of the United States of America," the idea of this representative government, and that power comes from the people. That is very much a John Locke idea. All men are created free and equal, have the right to, according to John Locke, life, liberty, and property. The Americans will change that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you can see his influence is there. They just put a different spin on it. And then we also have the constitutional article where we have the federal system of government created. We have our three branches of government, the system of checks and balances. So the Enlightenment idea that's being represented there is a separation of powers, and that is Montesquieu. Then we also have Articles of Confederation, which created the central government and the public election of the presidents. So this idea of a direct democracy comes from Rousseau, with a social contract between the government and the people. And then the Bill of Rights also promised free speech or freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So we see here religious tolerance and freedom, and that is an idea again from Voltaire, the ability to voice your ideas. And then lastly, we have the Bill of Rights protected against cruel and unusual punishment. So basically saying like accused citizens also have rights that protect them. And also your punishment should be fit to the crime that you commit. We didn't necessarily talk about Beccaria, but this is one of his ideas. So I just decided to add it in there for you guys. So all in all, when we look at the influence and the effects of the revolution going forward, in America, we're going to see some hostility between the British and the Americans going forward for a period of time. We're not necessarily going to focus on that in this class, but it's going to create that hostility between the British and the Americans. And then in Europe, these revolutionary ideas are going to go back to France and fuel the French Revolution. We're going to talk about the situation in France in a few days. And then we're also going to look at, again, Enlightenment ideas and how those are going to influence the French Revolution as well. But what's key here is that the French had aided the Americans in the Revolution. So the French soldiers coming back from the Revolutionary War, and also the French citizens, after seeing them aid the Americans in the Revolutionary War, are going to take those ideas back to France. And that's going to, again, be partially what fuels the French Revolution.